Morning all, nice to see you. I've got my cup of tea. It's 6:30 in the morning. I've been up since about 5:15. I spent the night at Old Hunstanton, which is further along the North Norfolk coast from here, and I've driven to Benham, which is about 20 miles away from there. I need my cup of tea just to wake up. I thought I'd take you on a bit of a church crawl today around this general area. There's some great churches around here, both small and large, and they contain some really wonderful things. Hopefully the weather will improve a bit. Church crawling is not all blue skies, I'm afraid. Today it's quite a foggy start. It's supposed to clear, but it's supposed to be light cloud for the whole of the day, but it shouldn't stop us enjoying it anyway. So I'm hoping you can see me and also see the thing behind me. The building behind me is Benham PRI. What you can see is the west end of the nave of the Priory Church. The nave is the only part that actually survives, the rest is in ruins, and it really is a most significant building. Benham Priory is a typical example of a small English monastery. It was a dependent cell of the great Benedictine Abbey of St Albans and never had more than 15 resident monks. The Priory were also lords of the manor of Benham, and the whole settlement was dependent on the monastery for its survival. Most of the Priory Church, the cloister, the domestic buildings are now in ruins, as you can see, though the ruins stand to some height. But only the nave, the part of the Priory Church used by the parishioners in the Middle Ages, is still roofed. It is still the parish church. The nave of the Priory Church was completed over a 100-year period between 1150 and 1250. The west front once had this massive west window, which is now blocked with brick, which is a great shame, as this is a very historically significant piece of architecture. It's in this window that we see for the first time in England a French innovation in architecture called bar tracery. What that means is that the window originally had lots of narrow stone bars called mullions, dividing individual lights in the window from one another. This was a significant innovation that allowed medieval masons for the first time to construct very large windows just like this one that flooded churches with the light. It must have been exciting to be alive in this period, with such building technology being constantly improved. When it was blocked up with brick in the 18th century, the Georgian parishioners of Benham were less interested in medieval architecture and much more interested in saving themselves from horrible drafts and expensive repair bills. Brick was much cheaper than stone and glass. Bear in mind, this is a very small priory church, but the Norman and early Gothic architecture of this space is still very impressive. With the nave rising to some height, it rises through 3 stories, for above the main Norman arcade is another called the Triforium, and above that is a further story with windows called the Clear Story, which has a walkway in front of it. You wouldn't get me walking up there, but the drone shows it off nicely. One of the things that survives here is the base of the 15th century rood screen. It once had images of the saints painted on it, but these were overpainted after the Reformation with godly texts from the Bible. The faces can still be seen peeping through the whitewash. I will come back to do a longer video on Benham, as there is much to see and say about this building. The whole structure, still beautiful, is a very poignant icon of the turbulence and destruction of the English Reformation. Hello, so I'm at church number 2 of the day, which is All Saints at East Barsham. It's had a hard life, it's missing bits. So it's missing its chancel, that's gone completely, but it's also missing most of its tower as well. So if we go around the west end here, just coming around the west end of the church, and the tower peculiarly is on the north side, the northwest side of the church. And we'll see it in a moment, just up here behind me. But most of it is gone. All that's left really here, if I go like that, I'm not very good with this selfie stick business, am I? Behind me there, I'll do a proper video of this. And behind me is all that's left of the tap. There's very little of it left at all. It is basically now just a truncated bottom. It's the porch and nothing else. So let's go and have a look inside. So here we are inside All Saints at East Barsham. And though it's a building that's missing most of its constituent parts from the Middle Ages, it's a building of great charm indeed. It's very, very simple inside. Typical medieval church. It's got a wonderful smell of it, the smell of old stone and old woodwork and years of damp. It's a wonderful smell, I think, personally. Being close to Walsingham too, which is a big Anglo-Catholic centre since the 1920s, this church also has been touched with ritualism and Anglo-Catholicism, some really very nice modern fittings. But the thing I really want to show you here is the monument, which I think you might just be able to see behind me on the wall there, which dates from the 17th century and is really very significant indeed. This monument, a marble tablet beside the communion table, is that of a young woman called Mary Calthorpe. She was a rich heiress, the daughter of William Fermor of East Barsham Manor, and she had married, aged 16, James Calthorpe. The couple had two sons, both called Fermor Calthorpe, who died as infants, the first in 1635 and the second in 1637, and Mary died in 1640 at the age of 28. James had the monument erected to his virtuous and well-beloved wife by one of the finest firms of masons of the day, two men, brothers, who had the rather colourful name of Christmas. I'm not sure the Calthorpes would have approved of that, as they were Puritans. John and Matthias Christmas lived and worked in Chatham, where they were carvers to the navy as well as monumental masons, and they were also pageant artificiers, providing the temporary props and structures for the annual Lord Mayor's pageant in London. Many of their monuments, including Mary's, show something of a flair for the dramatic. At the top we see the Calthorpe and Fermor coat of arms, flanked by two virtues, wisdom and innocency, and between the virtues is an angel blowing the last trump to raise the dead, with the scroll directing the dead to arise and come to judgment. And below we see the figure of Mary rising from the dead. She is dressed in her burial shroud and she's sitting up in her coffin. Her hand is raised and her eyes are fixed to the east, from whence Christ will come. Behind her are two angels, one offering her a heavenly crown and the other a laurel leaf of victory. It's very striking, almost theatrical composition expressing James Calthorpe's terrible grief at losing his entire family, but also his Christian hope in the resurrection of the dead. On the floor under the altar are slabs that once marked the site of the family's burial vault below the now lost chancel. In one of the church windows are some lovely fragments of medieval glass. In the centre are two panels depicting the Virgin Mary's visitation to her cousin Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. They are flanked on either side by angels playing musical instruments, a crumhorn and a harp. Below them are the tops of canopies that would once have gone over larger, now lost figures of saints. I'm already on church number 3 of the day, and I'm at St Giles in Houghton St Giles, otherwise known as Houghton in the Dale. A beautiful, sweet little church this. But I've come to Houghton St Giles to show you the object that is directly behind me, the rood or chancel screen, which dates from the 15th century. On the bottom of it, on the dado, are painted figures from that period, figures of the saints. They were really beautifully painted when original, but you'll notice as we have a look at them that they have been very badly affected by iconoclasm in the middle of the 16th century. On the side of the screen directly behind me are figures of female saints, and they're the Holy Kindred, the family of Jesus, the extended family of Jesus. While on this side, there are figures of male saints, 4 of which are the Latin doctors of the church, St Augustine of Hippo, St Gregory the Great, St Jerome and St Ambrose, but there are also 2 popes as well, St Clement, if I remember, and St Sylvester, and there's also a kneeling figure of the donor, the person who paid for the screen to be made. What is distressing about this beautiful screen is that the figures have been the victims of Protestant iconoclasm during the Reformation, with the faces of many of the saints scraped away, in some places right down to the bare wood. Despite this vicious attack, the delicate quality of these paintings and their subtle palette still show through. Bear in mind, these were painted around 1470. It's not simply a story of iconoclasm here. There has been restoration and revival too. The Anglo-Catholicism of nearby Walsingham has touched the church, and the chancel was beautifully refurnished in the 20th century with a new altar and image of the patron St Giles. The churchyard here is a favourite spot of mine. It is a delight to stand beside this old flint church looking north over the gently undulating landscape and valley formed by the River Stiffkey. I was so excited to get my drone in the air before it rained that I forgot to do a talking head at this church, which is St Andrew's at Little Snoring. This is the only round tower church of the day. Now, round towers are a peculiarity of East Anglian churches. There are 124 of them in Norfolk in total, with 38 in Suffolk and a smattering in Essex and Cambridgeshire. There are only 5 in the rest of England. The reason why there are so many round towers in Norfolk is not entirely clear, but ease of construction probably explains it. There is not much good building stone in this part of the world, but lots and lots of flint. Flint makes for very durable building material, but it is not good for making the angles of buildings called quoins. It was probably much easier to construct a round tower than a square one, which would have needed the use of imported stone. Little Snoring Church is unusual in that its tower, which may date from the late 11th century, is detached from the main church building, which dates from the 12th century. Again, the reason for this is not entirely clear, but you can see looking at the east face of the tower with its arch that it was once attached to a church. It appears that in the 12th century this church was abandoned, except for the tower, in favour of a new building. That's most probably because it was unstable, for the church is constructed on land that slopes away. In fact, as you can see from the drone footage, the church is set in quite a dramatic position within the Norfolk landscape. Here's the bottom of the tower with its Norman arch made of cast stone quarried 30 miles away, but let's go through the south doorway of the present church and have a look inside. The south doorway is very strange. It is constructed of 12th century stones but reset in the 13th century to make a pointed arch. The church is surprisingly wide and spacious and doesn't seem to have had any side aisles. Looking east, it is evident that the church was rebuilt in the 13th century, the chancel having 13th century or early English style Gothic lancet windows. There are 1 or 2 old fittings, a Georgian pulpit, but otherwise the church is sparsely furnished. But it has a lovely feel to it. It feels at one with the surrounding landscape. At the back of the church is the baptismal font, which is seemingly of Norman date. It most probably predates the present church, and when brought to Little Snoring may well have been installed in the previous building attached to the round tower. Rather weather-beaten, it is decorated with foliage and scroll work. So here I am in St Mary's Great Snoring. Norfolk has some fantastic place names, and Snoring is perhaps one of the most unusual one. The name has nothing to do with poor sleep hygiene. It is in fact an Old English, an Anglo-Saxon name, which means the place where snorers folk or snorers family lived. It is one of those buildings that has a real sort of texture to it, with lots of really interesting fittings too, as well as very fine architecture. We are looking east now towards the chancel and the 15th century chancel or rood screen. And as we look down the nave, you'll see these paments, these red paments on the floor, which are a Norfolk speciality, all made locally, and a whole series of 15th century bench ends. There are monuments and other delights to enjoy here too. So let's go and have a bit of a look around. The 15th century chancel screen here was once richly painted, but now the painting is in a sorry state. 2 panels only remain, and they have fallen foul of Protestant iconoclasm. One is a beautiful image of the Virgin and Child, Mary being the patron of the church, and has received brutal treatment. Mary's face and most of Christ have been expunged. Holding a spray of red roses, her symbol, there is still a beauty to this image. The image of the Holy Trinity in the next panel has been equally badly treated by the fanaticism of iconoclasm. Moving through the screen, we enter the wide and spacious 14th century chancel, and on the south side of the altar we can still see the triple arch sedilia where the pre-Reformation clergy would sit during Mass, along with the piscina next to it for washing the sacred vessels. The walls of the chancel at Great Snoring are adorned with a series of tablets that commemorate many of the 17th and 18th century rectors of the parish. The right to present the rector to Great Snoring was in the hands of St John's College, Cambridge, and they usually presented one of their fellows to it. And it was a rich living too, worth nearly £600 in the 1870s. The finest of these tablets is this one to Dr. Robert West and his wife. He was rector both of here and Fakenham and died in 1610. There's a tiny scatter of 15th century stained glass in a couple of the windows in the chancel. That in the south window includes images of angels that were probably from a series of the 9 orders of angels. How wonderful the windows would have been when replete with such beauty. As we leave the church, notice over the doorway the royal arms of King James II, a very rare thing. They bear the date 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution that saw Catholic James lose his throne and flee to the continent. Heading outside, we see the great scale of this building from the east, and notice how the masonry is primarily flint, but with limestone dressings, and the areas are also rendered on the outside. When originally constructed, the flint work was all treated in this way. It was hidden from view. At the west end of the church is the substantial former rectory where those wealthy rectors lived. It began life as part of a mansion built in 1525 by the Shelton family and is a very fine example of Tudor brickwork. So it's just gone 5 and at my last church of the day, St Mary Magdalene's at Warham, this wonderful 15th century flint structure behind me here. I think that's particularly striking about this building is that you walk in and you walk back into the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. It's still got within it all its furnishings from the late Georgian period, but it's also got within it a collection of stained glass, some of which comes from other Norfolk churches, some of it from here, but a lot of it is continental glass that was collected in the early 19th century and brought here. So here we are inside, and as I say, this building is a time warp from 1800. The church, which was the Chapel of Ease, not the parish church, that's at the other end of the village, was not heavily restored by the Victorians. The Victorians hated the type of seating we see in here, called box pews, and had they restored the church they would have thrown them out, but they're actually rather practical in a cold, drafty church building. They also hated the type of pulpit we see here, a triple decker with seats for the vicar and parish clerk. The top story has suspended over it what is called a sounding board, a primitive amplification system. Both the pews and the pulpit are made of cheap timber, deal or pine, but the pews have been painted to resemble mahogany and the pulpit oak. Up in the chancel, the Georgian communion table is set behind Georgian altar rails, and to the left is a doorway to the rather creepy Turner Mausoleum, which has memorial slabs to the family on the floor and their heraldic hatchments on the wall. They are buried in the vault below it. As I said outside, the church is worth visiting for its collection of old stained glass. The chancel windows are full of stained glass that was brought here by the Reverend W.H. Langton, the rector who put the box pews in. He bought the glass from a dealer called J.C. Hamp of Norwich in 1806. The glass, which is richly coloured, is primarily Flemish and Northern German, of 16th century date, and most probably came from monasteries that were dissolved in the wake of the French Revolution. There was quite a market in England among antiquarian collectors for continental glass in this period. That glass is very beautiful, but my favourite stained glass in this church is in the north window of the nave, which has been set also by Langton, with a collection of English medieval glass. Now we don't know if this glass comes entirely from Warham or whether Langton was collecting glass from other churches. I bet it's the latter. The window is full of little heads and figures of angels and saints, mostly dating from the 15th century, but some are earlier too. They gaze out benignly at you. Each one is a tiny work of art, and because the window is so low, you can get close up to them to appreciate the delicate brushwork and skill of the medieval glass painter and the unique character of each. Now, if I were to single out a couple of favourites from this collection, there are these two lovely little angels playing viols, and this gorgeous angel, one of a pair, swinging a censer. So lively. Warham St Mary Magdalene is an absolute delight of a building, and if you are in North Norfolk, I do recommend a visit. So that's me done, folks. I do hope you have enjoyed my little church call in Norfolk. It's gone 5 o'clock, nearly 5:30 now. It's really nice because the days are lengthening, which is fabulous. But it's still very, very crisp. It's got quite a nip in the air. I'm looking forward to getting in the car and driving home. I'll leave you with a view across the rolling fields of North Norfolk from the churchyard at Warham. Thanks very much for watching.